Well, hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Stevens. I'll be talking about Herb and Jan Kahn's remarkable needles climbing career tonight, and also discussing my inspiration for and methodology of my guidebook, The Adventure Climbs of Herb and Jan Kahn. And I've also, with Jan's permission and the help of Cheryl and Daryl Stisser, raided the Kahn's old stash of climbing gear. So we have some mid-20th century artifacts to discuss, including their pitons, their piton hammers, kind of a newer rope, couldn't find the old manila rope, I got the gold line, and a few other goodies. So you'll get a chance to peruse those later. I want to begin by emphasizing that the Kahns, and especially Herb, were very reclusive. So it's a little strange to be up here offering biographical information about them from the get-go. So I'm going to keep this first bit a little kind of intentionally opaque. So forgive me if you know this first bit, but it does seem a logical way to begin. Herb and Jan Kahn were climbers from the East Coast who moved to the Custer area in 1949 and climbed, mapped, and explored the Needles in the 1950s. They made over 200 first descents between 1947 and 1959, and their climbing is a crucial first chapter in the magnificent ongoing saga of the Needles. They were innovative in every sense of the word. They rethought the rudimentary climbing footwear of the day, donning inexpensive, smooth-soled tennis shoes instead of the heavy, hobnailed boots that were then in vogue. We have examples of both to look at later. And they climbed down their routes rather than rappelling. And they set the stage for what would later become a key tenet of Needles climbing ethics by never resorting to points of aid. Every move on their climbs in the 50s was done free. And that philosophy didn't become dominant in other parts of the US until the free climbing revolution of the 1970s. Herb and Jan began climbing on the cliffs of Carderock near Washington, D.C. in 1942, while Herb was working for the Navy as an electrical engineer during World War II. At Carderock, they established routes like Jan's face and Herbie's horror, now rated at 5'9", along with numerous classics at Seneca Rocks, West Virginia, and in New England and other locales. After the war, they embarked on an extended climbing road trip to the American West, living out of a converted panel truck and presaging #van life by some 80 years. They originally came to the Black Hills area in 1947, hoping to make an ascent of Devil's Tower. In those days, climbers needed written permission from the park superintendent to climb the tower, so they decided to return the following year for that and visited the Needles instead as a consolation prize. They had heard that there was something to climb in South Dakota, of all places, and they wanted to investigate. The Needles, until the arrival of the Kahns, had seen very little climbing activity. Fritz Wiesner had passed through in 1936, making a sense of inner outlet behind Sylvan Lake, the totem pole right on the Needles Highway, and Olton's Shoulder near Mount Rushmore. When the Kahns arrived 11 years later, they found hundreds and hundreds of unclimbed granite pinnacles, blocks and bread loaves, and they made 2 first descents during that fateful stop in 1947, both near the Needles Eye parking lot, the Fan and the exclamation point. Herb described their ascent to the Fan in an article for Appalachia in 1948, writing, quote, "Being modest and a little unsure that we would be able to get off the ground at all, we grabbed our climbing gear and slipped out of sight amongst the rocks. In a few minutes, we were completely isolated from the throngs of picture takers and initial scratchers at the parking lot. We wondered vaguely if we would be able to find our way back through the maze, but at the moment we were more concerned about finding routes upward. It was a simple matter to get into one of the many chimneys separating the Needles and worm our way up. After perhaps 60 feet of climbing, the chimney became too wide to reach across. Suddenly, we were conscious of how high we were, but to Jan at least the hold seemed good, and she led on up to a little sloping shelf. She banged around up there for quite some time, trying to put in a piton, and at length she announced that she had 2 of them in, one of which might possibly be good. With this secure upper belay, I found it quite an enjoyable climb up over the quartz nubbles. A 15-foot crack, about wide enough for the insertion of one knee, brought us out on top of our needle. It wasn't long before we were spotted. A woman exclaimed, "How in the world did you get up there?" Jan casually replied, "Oh, we came up the back," end quote. So the fan for the climbers in the room is the formation that the more traveled route Moonlight Rib is on, although the con route ascends the chimney up the backside. If you've climbed John's Jump, you've climbed half the con route on the fan, but instead of jumping, you just keep climbing. And even if you're not a climber, I think you can still appreciate this maybe strange-seeming accomplishment, and at least the con's skill at eluding tourists and remaining in good humor when forced to field their questions. And that's on full display here in this early report. The con spotted the exclamation point downhill from the fan that same day in 1947 and went on to attain that summit as well. The Needles had captured their hearts and imaginations that day, and they returned in 1948 to complete 5 additional first ascents. And then they returned in 1949 and purchased land near Custer for $50 an acre. And it was then that their Needles climbing really took off. They went on in the 50s to make over 200 first ascents, and they surveyed the Needles and mapped the area in the days before GPS and Google Earth and all of our technological advances of today. Sorry about the humming. These surveying and mapping skills would later prove crucial in the 1960s as they transitioned from Needles climbers to explorers in Jewel Cave, which was thought to be a small cave before the cons arrived on the scene. I think it's the 2nd or 3rd longest in the world now. In addition to their prodigious rock climbing, the cons were multi-talented and sought to eke a living by whatever means they could. They lived very frugally, building what we might call now a tiny home by constructing a crude cabin beneath an outcrop on their new property, a structure that became known as the Con Cave. They had no running water, and despite Herb's previous post as an electrical engineer during the Second World War, no electricity. For work, they took odd jobs. Jan taught music lessons to kids in Custer and cleaned hotel rooms, where she met a fellow housekeeper who later became the inspiration for the heroine Red in her musical Run to Catch a Pine Cone. Herb, meanwhile, did high-angle repair work on Mount Rushmore. Jan was fond of saying in later years that they didn't know what they wanted to do, but they knew what they didn't want to do. What they didn't want was to hold a steady desk job that would interfere with their climbing. The pair also did plenty of woodworking and leatherworking and attempted to sell their wares and to make a little cash on the side. And I have some examples of their leatherwork to show you tonight, including a belt and a piton hammer holster. It's pretty cool. We'll take a look at that. Okay, so there is a picture of their sneakers. I'm going to try moving around a little bit. With piton hammers in mind, I want to talk about some of the equipment that they used in those early days. And this explanation comes with a caveat and some terrible news for those of you who may not have heard. In January of 2021, the concave burned down, and all their climbing journals were lost to a fire. Had I known that, I would have included more block quotations. Their climbing equipment collection is currently in a state of disarray and in need of better cataloging. And I was unable to locate their old Manila climbing rope, which is hopefully still buried in a pile in one of their outbuildings. I do have here one of their later ropes. So this is Gold Line. So a few folks in the room might recognize this. Yeah, how stiff that is. And it's supposedly a little stretchier than Manila. Let's see, and the cons, as was the custom in the 1950s, used no climbing harnesses, but rather tied the climbing rope around their waist with a bowline. I should have brought a contemporary rope to show you that. I don't even want to attempt a bowline on this stiff stuff. But basically, it was just around their waist, no harnesses, and they did not want to fall. Their shoes resembled Ked's sneakers, which they bought for $1.99 a pair. And they hated the heavy hobnailed boots. These were in their collection. I brought them not because the cons used them necessarily, but just so you could see how terrible and how heavy they were. So we'll get a chance to heft those in a bit. And Herb and Jan also used pitons for protection back then, which, true to their frugal nature, they had bootied. As we would say now, the Army had left these fixed in cracks back east, and they had taken them for their own ends, these abandoned pitons. So there were no cams back then, and no stoppers either. A climber would climb to a crack and pound in one of these pitons, which, as you can see, you can come up and it's kind of a newer one. This is a Chenard Lost Arrow, but there's some, this is an Army wafer piton here. I think if you climb the con roots now, and there's some angles here, you'll often see just kind of a ring hanging out of the crack. But there's not much to it. Some longer angles, ring angles out there as well. But so they would climb up to a crack and pound one of those things in. And I also have tonight both Herb and Jan's piton hammers. And I'm especially interested in these. I've attended quite a few of Jan's climbing talks at Devil's Tower. I think this is hers, this is Jan's. This is pretty similar to a Black Diamond, I think they call it the Yosemite hammer. Little lighter than that, but this is a pretty traditional, I think, piton hammer. Herb's, though, is very strange. He apparently loved this thing. Jan made a point of showing me how worn this was here, and she didn't like this one because you apparently had to really give it a big wallop, as she put it, to do it, to place a piton. So all this stuff is up here for you to peruse later. Okay. But yeah, that's quite a relic. And I think piton hammers are probably a really personal piece of gear, wouldn't you agree, Arch? So I was just, well, not that you'd know, you were around for the stopper revolution, yeah. But yeah, but yeah, I was really interested to see these. I had never seen them prior to last week, at least Herb's really bizarre looking piton hammer. So you can come up and see that later. The cons' creations in the needles are astonishing. Despite their modest ratings, these are very interesting climbs. Some of these, like Spires 2 and 4, Aquarium Rock, and perhaps their masterpiece, the con diagonal on outer outlet, as you can see right there, are bona fide uber classics. As for the rest, if you've climbed enough of them, you might start to notice certain patterns. With the exception of their route on Little Devil's Tower, which might not count because it was sort of a publicity stunt done at the behest of a newspaperman, there are no con routes on formations in the needles that you can scramble up easily or walk off. The climbs often begin on the uphill side, which by some quirk of the needles often has a chimney. When the chimney ends, you must usually climb a nubbly face to the summit. That pattern crops up repeatedly on many of these climbs, enough to be noticeable. But these needles are unique, and of course, there are exceptions. Pinpoint Pinnacle, for example, done late in their needles career right before they went into Jewel Cave for the first time in 1959, is a face climb. Their routes on Bell Tower and Wicked Picket begin, uncharacteristically, on the longer downhill side. I want to take a few minutes now, and if our technology cooperates, watch some old footage of the of the cons climbing their retable route on Inner Outlet behind Sylvan Lake. We were on an SDPB special called South Dakota Primetime. And I'm not sure the legality of showing that in this sort of situation. So just in case there is, it's weird to have a works cited page in the middle, but here is our MLA citation. So just so we're covered. Okay. All right, let's see. I have this entire episode on a flash drive, which I think should probably be in the Coalition vault somewhere. So we'll talk about that later, but we're just going to watch a few minutes of the cons climbing. And they do narrate, too, so we'll be able to hear Herb and Jan.
We had talked to the fellow in charge of the state park to kind of get permission to climb. And he said he said we had mountain goats and mountain sheep, might as well have mountain climbers. We appreciate your not taking pictures. I don't know, I think you can do it without that.
We're not proud of the performance we put on for the camera, I guess. put it that way.
When did you first come to the Black Hills then?
In 1947 was the first time we were just driving through, and we found the needles, and we were set to climb Devil's Tower and couldn't get permission, and so we climbed in the needles instead, and came back the next year to climb Devil's Tower and climb some more here.
I remember we climbed one summer, and then we went south to Arizona and worked in a dude ranch during the winter, thinking about coming back. And Herb kept saying, well, we don't want to make up our mind while we're here whether we're going to settle there or not. We've got to look at it with fresh eyes. And I remember we came back and we took the Harney Peak Trail and came down behind the spires there and looked at all of those towering rocks around us, and we said it's more than just in our head. This is the place we want to live.
How has climbing changed since your guys' heyday?
We weren't the bold kind of climbers that they are today. We tended to like, the only protection we could get was in a crack, and we tended to follow the cracks because we were really pretty chicken.
We were usually content with going up the easiest way, if we could find an easy way. And some of the pinnacles were harder than others. But there were so many of them, we didn't have to look for a harder route on something that had already been climbed.
When we got here, we decided that making a first descent was just a matter of getting there before anybody else did.
On a long climb, we'd try to alternate, and one person climb up and then the other climb up and pass them and on up and alternate the lead. But
we each had our own specialty, too.
Some climbs fit one of us better than others, and we could usually tell by looking at it which one of us would do better.
If it was a skinny crack, Herb had a better chance of getting in it than I did. And if it was a wide chimney, I could spread further than he could. It helps to have big hips because your legs start so far apart.
What kind of shoes did you use?
Tennis shoes,
Right,
$1.99.
this sort of thing.
We started off with a manila rope, $3.50 for 120 feet of it or something, and a pair of sneakers, and that was about it.
So basically that's all you had was pitons, your shoes, tennis shoes, and a manila rope.
Yeah.
We started using nylon before we came here. Right after the war, we managed to get a hold of nylon ropes.
And the rope was just tied around your waist with a bowline. None of these swami seats or anything of that sort. So you really did not want to fall, because
taking a long fall could really
could break your back. I mean, if you fell more than 15 feet, it didn't matter how good your gear was, because you'd probably break your back anyway. So you're kind of cautious.
Did you ever have many falls?
No. It didn't sound safe to us.
Until they got nylon ropes. The rope was the weak
Yeah.
link. The manila didn't stretch like nylon does, and if you fell very far, it was pretty sure to snap the rope.
Especially if the rope was old at all, because it's a natural fiber, and it dies. And after a year or two, you had to fork out another $3.50.
Do you still climb? Do you still do any rock climbing?
We do a little bit of scrambling. We don't usually get a rope out. It's still fun when your hands come into play and you've got a little bit of a drop beneath your feet. But I mean, there's a special kick to that. And certainly the climbing was something that always seemed very natural to us. I mean, it just felt like we were coming home the first time we ever climbed.
I started rock climbing back in 1999, and I was at a critical juncture in my life. In my late 20s, and I was at a critical juncture in my life. In my late 20s, with no direction, no college degree. I mentioned this earlier too, but it was a pretty dark time. And I've always been a fan of alternative music and punk rock. And I've always been a fan of alternative music and punk rock. And had lived until that point following the Sex Pistols' edict. Well, there was a future, as it turned out, and yet I was drifting in time and space without a rudder or any sort of plan. And yet I was drifting in time and space without a rudder or any sort of plan. At a pretty low point, just completely miserable and in desperate need of something. At a pretty low point, just completely miserable and in desperate need of something. Climbing, and I found that something in rock climbing. To be more specific, finding and climbing the Conrads saved my life. And to be more specific, finding and climbing the Conrads. I was born and raised in Pierre, South Dakota in the 1970s, and fled immediately after graduating high school in the 1970s, and fled immediately after graduating high school. Olympia, Washington, Eugene, Oregon. Living in Tampa, Florida, Olympia, Washington, Eugene, Oregon, Minnesota, and for 6 long years. But I did read Crack Hours into Thin Air in Minnesota, and I mentioned this earlier. But I did read Crack Hours into Thin Air, and it just kind of captured my entire imagination. So I was intrigued. Kind of captured my and I began imagination at Taylor's Falls, about 45 minutes northeast of the Twin Cities. And I began climbing at Taylor's Falls, about 45 minutes Black Hills and Devil's Tower with awe. Climbers there spoke of the Black Hills and Devil's Tower with awe. Realized that maybe South Dakota. For the first time in my life, I realized that maybe South Dakota didn't suck. I began road tripping to the Needles, Rushmore, and Devil's Tower back in 2000. I began road tripping to the Needles, Rushmore, and Devil's Tower back in 2000. And made a fateful purchase from then-owner Sue Sherbeck in Hill City. A copy of Paul Piana's from then-owner Sue Sherbeck. You could buy it. A copy of Paul Piana's 1983 guidebook, Touch the Sky. I remained in Minneapolis for another year or two, climbing locally, but also road tripping west to the tower to Rushmore at Devil's Tower. As much as became a key and very encouraging mentor to me. Sanders at Devil's Tower. And on dark and frigid winter evenings back in Minneapolis, I would read Touch the Sky like a novel. Back in Minneapolis, I would read Touch the Sky like a novel, and wonder about these names that cropped up over Herb and Jan Kahn. The ratings Piana had given their climbs didn't seem terribly intimidating either. The ratings Piana had given their climbs didn't seem terribly intimidating either. I was leading climbs in the gym and on the bolted roofs of Red Wing, and when I could get there, I was leading climbs in the gym and on the bolted roofs of Red Wing, and when I could get there, traditional or trad climbing. And I assumed that these con routes would be a good way to learn traditional or trad climbing. I didn't yet know about long traverses or runouts. I didn't yet know about long traverses, and I also didn't realize that these climbs would shape the trajectory of my life. And I also didn't realize that these climbs. I want to pause right there for a moment and define those terms for the non-climbers pause right there for a moment and define those terms for the non-climbers in the audience.
Exactly what it sounds like.
Going
Sideways.
a traverse on
is
vertical
exactly
rock,
what
a
it
climber
sounds
might
like.
have to
Going
traverse
sideways.
to get to another crack
On
system.
vertical rock, a
Or
climber
line of
might have to
handholds.
traverse to get to
This is
another
not
crack
always as
system.
easy as
Or a
it
line of
sounds.
handholds.
And if there aren't many
This is not
opportunities to
always
place
as
protection
easy
in the
as it
rock,
sounds. A traverse can be
and if there aren't many
very
opportunities
exciting
to place protection
at
in the
best.
rock,
A traverse can be
my climbing partners
very
and I used to
exciting
joke that even the
at best.
climbers who weren't going first
My
or
climbing
leading,
partners and I used to
were
joke
still
that even the
leading
climbers
many
who
of the
weren't
con
going
routes.
first or leading,
The second climber
were
couldn't
still
fall
leading
either.
many of the con routes.
A run out, on the other
second
hand,
climber
means that
couldn't
there might
fall
be
either.
long distances between
A
cracks
run
or
out,
features
on
in
the
the
other
rock that
hand,
can be
means
used
that
for
there might be
protection,
long distances
which can be
between
dangerous
cracks or features in
and
the
or
rock that can be used
exhilarating
for
for the
protection.
lead climber,
Which can be
The
dangerous
Needles
and
has a
or
reputation
exhilarating
for its
the
run-out
lead
climber.
bold climbs. Thank you,
The
Bob.
Needles
Archbold.
has a reputation for its run-out bold climbs. Thank
He
you,
is
Bob
here tonight.
Archbold. Herb and Jan Kahn's rock climbs, though not
He
as
is here
technically
tonight.
difficult as the climbs
Herb
of
and
today,
Jan Kahn's
usually
rock climbs,
feature
though not as
traverses
technically
and
difficult
as the climbs
and
of today,
sometimes run-out
usually
traverses,
feature traverses
where
and
no member of the
run-outs.
climbing party
And
could
sometimes
safely take
run
a
out
fall
traverses,
without risking a
where no
dramatic
member of the
pendulum
climbing
swing
party could safely
across
take
the
a fall
frightfully
without
abrasive
risking a
needles
dramatic
crystals.
pendulum swing
And a
across the
sandbag
frightfully
means that a
abrasive
climb is
needles
harder,
crystals.
sometimes much harder than advertised.
And a sandbag means
Even
that a climb
either
is
in
harder,
print or
sometimes
by word
much
of
harder
mouth.
than advertised.
Rock climbs, we
Even
mentioned this
either in
earlier, are
print or
rated
by
according
word
to
of
the
mouth.
Yosemite decimal
Rock
system.
climbs, we mentioned this earlier, are
with the
rated
5
according to the
indicating
Yosemite
technical fifth
decimal
class climbing
system,
with ropes and other specialized
with the
equipment.
5 indicating technical fifth
5-0
class
is
climbing
the
with ropes and other
easiest
specialized
grade, and
equipment.
5-15 is cutting edge.
5-0 is the easy,
And many of the folks in this room can manage 5'10", 5'11", 5'12".
And many of the folks in this room can manage
5'10", 5'11", 5'12".
For my part, I was never
5'13",
particularly
you know
a
who you are.
bold or talented
For my
climber.
part, I was never
even in my
particularly
younger
a
days when I was
bold or
strong and
talented
fairly fit.
climber.
Even
the
in my
Needles
younger
gave me
days when I was
something
strong and
that I
fairly
couldn't
fit
get
anywhere else.
But the Needles
A
gave me
sense of
something
peace,
that I couldn't
perhaps.
get anywhere else.
Maybe it's the
A
rose
sense of
quartz.
peace. Or maybe it's the
perhaps.
weird and highly
Maybe it's the
specialized
rose
needles
quartz.
climbers have to do.
Maybe it's the weird
to ascend
and highly
descend those
specialized
spires.
needles climbers have to do.
Or maybe it's the
to ascend
otherworldly
and descend
or
those spires.
innerworldly.
Lord
or
of the
maybe it's
Rings
the otherworldly or innerworldly.
But even now,
Lord of the Rings
after 2
esque
decades
setting.
of wandering around, looking for
But even
con
now,
routes,
I
after
really
2
only
decades
feel
of
at
wandering
home when I'm in
around,
the Needles.
looking for con routes,
I really
so in
only
my
feel at
in
home
terms
when
of
I'm
my
in the
hoping to
Needles.
learn the art of traditional climbing on these
So in my
seemingly
in
easy
terms of my
con
hoping
routes,
to learn the
I
art
was
of
in for a
traditional
wild
climbing
ride
on
and a
these sobering
seemingly
education.
easy con routes.
I was in for a
Many of
wild
the con
ride
routes
and a
listed in
sobering
Touch the
education.
Sky were sandbags. I eventually
Many of the
discovered.
con
And
routes
they did
listed in
feature
Touch the
runouts
Sky
and
were
traverses.
sandbags. I
But
eventually
back in late
discovered. And they did
2002,
feature
after
runouts
a series
and
of road
traverses.
trips to the Needles without
But
a
back
climbing
in late
partner,
2002,
in which I
after a series
attempted
of road
sometimes
trips to the Needles
successfully,
without a
sometimes
climbing
not,
partner,
in
to
which I
rope solo
attempted
a few
sometimes
intriguing
successfully,
low fifth class
sometimes
con
not,
routes,
I
I
began
began
to
to
plan
plan
a
a
move
move
back
back
to my
intriguing
home
low
state of South
fifth class
Dakota.
con routes.
I
I
began
left
to plan a
Minnesota
move
in
back
March
to
of
my home state of
2003
South
and
Dakota.
moved to Hill City to work at
I
Granite
left Minnesota
Sports
in
and
March
see
of
what I could find in
2003
the
and
Needles.
moved to Hill City
to work at Granite
And at that
Sports
point,
and
I was
see
just
what
getting
could
out
find in the
climbing as much
Needles.
as I could. And I climbed at Rushmore
And at that
and
point,
Devil's
I was
Tower
just getting out
just
climbing
as much as I did at
could.
Sylvan
And I
Lake
climbed
in the
at
Needles.
Rushmore and Devil's Tower.
But the body
just
of those
as much as I did at
200
Sylvan
plus
Lake
con
in the
routes
Needles
was always in the back of my
But
mind.
the body of those 200
and I climbed
plus
the classic
con routes
well-traveled
was always
con
in the
routes
back of my
first.
mind.
Spires 1, 2,
And I climbed
4,
the classic
in the
well-traveled
cathedral spires,
spires
the
first.
con diagonal,
Spires 1, 2, and
and
4,
Aquarium Rock.
in the cathedral spires, the
I
con
quickly
diagonal,
got this sense in the
and Aquarium Rock.
mid-2000s that the rest of the con routes
quickly
didn't
got
get
this
climbed
sense
very
in the
often.
mid-2000s
that the rest of the con routes didn't get
No one talked
climbed
about
very
them much,
often.
and all the cool kids seemed to be at Rushmore.
No one talked
And on
about
the then
them much.
emerging
And
limestone
all the cool
routes up in
kids seemed to
Spearfish
be at
Canyon.
Rushmore.
And on
But
the then
whenever I
emerging
could, I
limestone
went out and
routes
looked
up
for
in
con
Spearfish
routes,
Canyon.
armed with Piana's books and
But
maps.
whenever I
and
could, I
was
went out and looked
particularly
for con
interested in the
routes,
tangled
armed
maze
with
of Piana's
pinnacles
books
known
and
as
maps,
the
and I was
cathedral spires.
particularly interested in the
I
tangled
slowly
maze of
began to
pinnacles
unlock
known
the
as
spire's
cathedral
secrets
spires.
simply by spending lots of time
I slowly
attempting to
began
find
to
the high
unlock
point
the
of each of
spire's
the spire's
secrets
nine
simply by
bridges,
spending lots of
which the
time
cons had
attempting to
assigned
find
a
the
number
high
to,
point of each
and
of
then
the
branching
spire's
out
9
from there.
there, which the cons had assigned a number to. Spire 9, I reasoned, then it shouldn't be hard to find East Peak. If one could find Spire 9, I reasoned, then it shouldn't be hard to find East Peak and Trident next to it.
There's a lot that's not on the map.
Okay,
There's a lot. But the first really obscure con route I attempted to find was a short little cathedral spire. But the first really obscure con route I attempted to find was a short little piano rites of moving finger, which the cons climbed in May of 1953. Touch the sky, piano rites of moving finger, which the cons climbed in May of 1953. Like its two neighbors, this is the southernmost spire on the Spire 2 Ridge. Its name relates to Omar Khayyam's of Light and Tower of Darkness. Its name relates to Omar Khayyam's hesitated to climb it for a while. Semicolon. Also, the cons hesitated to climb it for a while. End quote. Doesn't that sound delightful? In the wind. His description for their route was a bit more reassuring. He simply rates it a 5.3. His description for their route was a bit more reassuring. He simply rates it a 5.3 and says, quote, ascended chimney that starts on the east side. End quote. That sounded perfect for a new trad leader. But nobody I talked to seemed to know where it was. But nobody I talked to near the mouth of the 2-3 gully was. Near climbs this is a formation near the mouth of the 2-3 gully, as well as other non-con classic, like the con route on Spire 2, as well as other non-con international chimney. Cat's Meow. Yet no one had any idea which spire international chimney. Yet no one had any idea which spire moving finger everyone just shrugged and said they didn't know. I asked local hotshots and climbing guides, so like the cons, I too hesitated to climb it for a while, but not because it appeared to wave in the wind. So like the cons, I too hesitated to climb it for a while, but not because it was, and I realized that some of the con routes were in danger. Something seemed to miss that no one knew where it was, and I realized that some of the con routes were in danger. And this was a climb that didn't seem to quite square with what was presented in Touch the Sky. This was a climb that didn't seem to quite square with what was presented in Touch the Sky. None quite fit the description in Piana's book or on the map. And none quite fit the description in Piana's book or on the map. So Moving Finger finally figured it out. Over a year later, while I was sitting at the little overlook between Balcony Point and Rubaiyat Spire. While I was sitting at the little overlook from that exact spot, Moving Finger resembled an index finger pointing skyward. Moving Finger resembled an index finger pointing skyward. I climbed most of it, the chimney, the following spring, stymied by the final few exposed moves onto its airy spring, stymied by the final few exposed moves onto its airy summit. And I returned a couple weeks later and led the last little bit of the climb to that summit. And I returned a couple weeks later and the top of Moving Finger is a climb to that summit. That's in the snow. The top of Moving Finger is a small block. It's cracked both vertically and horizontally. But you can kind of see the cracks. It's cracked both vertically and horizontally. So I had to down climb back to the belay. Not amenable to it was so satisfying. So I had to down climb back to the belay. Not because I'd succeeded in climbing it in good style and had overcome my anxiety about that very exposed move on the face, but because I'd found it at all. Very exposed move on the face. Moving Finger was the first obscure con route that I'd figured out. Moving Finger was the first obscure con route that I'd figured out. And for my book, my climbing partners and I decided, after a bit of a heated debate, for my book, my climbing partners and I decided, after a bit of a heated debate, by modern standards, but is a little bit more accurate. This is still a modest grade by modern standards. And during this time period in the mid-2000s, I was living my version of the climbing life. And during this time period in the mid-2000s, I was living my version of the climbing life. First opened the door to becoming a ski patroller in 2004, and later in 2006 to becoming a ski patroller at Sylvan Rocks Climbing School. And later in 2006, in terms of housing, I've always had cats. So I never got to housing. I've always had periods in the forest. So I never got to live for in a van down by the river. Extended periods in a forest, as has long been the goal for so-called self-professed. As has long been the goal for. I did, however, have two very important housing situations. I did, however, have two very important housing situations, which would later become very inexpensive winter housing in Leeds, South Dakota, and a fabulous house-sitting gig just outside of Custer. Retired National Park Service gig just outside of Custer. Trusted me. Retired National Park Service Rangers while they traveled the world in the summer. And his former Jewel Cave Rangers while they traveled the world in the summer. And his former Jewel Cave Rangers, they graciously turned half of their new garage into a woodworking shop. In fact, they graciously turned half of their new garage into a woodworking shop for Jan. And so I had the opportunity to see Jan on a regular basis during those summers. And so I had the opportunity to trying and failing to find some of her climbs, I would occasionally accost her. After trying and failing to find some of her climbs, I would occasionally done on July 7th, 1956. Demand to know, for example, what she had done on July 7th, 1956. She would laugh and say she didn't remember what she'd done yesterday. yesterday. She would laugh and look it up in her climbing journal what she'd done yesterday, but she would look it up in her climbing journal
also, while my very patient climbing partners and I were having decent success demystifying the cathedral spires and the rest of the formations in Custer State Park, we began the much more daunting task of trying to figure out some of the other areas the playground and the Chessmen Creek. These climbing areas are located in the Black Elk Wilderness. And if nobody I'd spoken with knew where located in the Black Elk Wilderness, they most certainly had no idea where Breaking Wave, Sultan's Tower, they most certainly had no idea where Breaking Wave, Sultan's Tower, these and many other conroutes still lurked in the wilderness. Keeping their secrets. These and many other conroutes complicate matters further when the cons climbed in these areas in the 1950s. They were able to drive when the cons climbed in these areas in the 1950s. After the Black Elk Wilderness was created in 1950 and thus became subject to the Black Elk Wilderness was created in 1950 and thus became subject to the stipulations. The days of driving merrily around the lower slopes and drainages of Black Elk Peak. The days of driving merrily around the lower slopes. We had to figure out new approaches to these rocks. My friend Tim Fadness. We had to figure out new approaches to these rocks, and my friend Tim Fadness did much of the legwork in finding an updated approach to the South Fork of Grizzly Bear Creek. Did much of the legwork in finding an updated approach to the South Fork of Grizzly Bear Creek. Come in through the cathedral spires rather than by Camp Remington, he huffed. Come in through the cathedral spires rather than by Camp Remington, he huffed. And it would shave 2 miles off of our hike. When Cheryl Stisser and I used this tactic to find and climb the torch back in Grizzly Bear Creek. When Cheryl Stisser and I used this tactic to find and climb the torch back in Grizzly Bear Summit, and that too was very exciting. We discovered a con register. This went beyond mere climbing in a way into a field approaching something like. This went beyond mere climbing in a way into a field approaching something like archaeology. And once we'd found one climb, one landmark, like the torch, we were able to locate. And once we'd found one climb, one landmark, like the torch, we were able to locate others, like Yellow Devil, Portal Peak, the Conditioner. We didn't find all the con routes, but we found most of them. Despite the limitations of the maps and but we found most of them. Despite the limitations of the maps, something like follow the obvious instructions and touch the sky that read something like follow the obvious route. Open to interpretation directions were invariably accompanied by my favorite open to interpretation directions were invariably accompanied by my favorite climbing rating of all time. 5 Our exploratory hikes continued with the philosophy that we had to go visit them first. Our exploratory hikes continued with the philosophy that we had to go visit them first, and it would be better to go in light and fast. We soon found that the playground and the chessmen needed to be approached from Horse Thief Lake. We soon found that the playground and the chessmen needed to be approached from Horse Thief Lake, along with Grizzly North Fork. And that Nelson Creek was best for those areas were very dedicated, hard-bitten folks. My climbing partners for those areas were very dedicated, hard-bitten folks. It takes a special person to hike. I'd been keeping crude notes all throughout this period of con routing just for my own reference. I'd been keeping crude notes all throughout this period of con routing just for my own reference. However, had gone out of print. Publishing them. And no amount of cajoling, however, had gone out of print. And while my small network of climbing partners and I had created a sort of cool underground activity with the partners and I had created a sort of cool underground activity with the them, while valuable at least to us, was a highly specialized undertaking. To find them, while valuable at least to us, was a highly specialized undertaking. But not really. I mean, how could they? We were waist deep in ferns and moss, but not 3 miles back in the Black Elk Wilderness. We were waist deep in ferns and moss, 3 miles back in the Black Elk Wilderness. About at the bar. Nobody could see us from the road. Nobody knew what we were exclaiming about at the bar, and the ratings on the Yosemite. My original goal was to get another round of Touch the Skies printed. Since more and more newer climbers were going without. Touch the Skies printed. These efforts, however, climbers were going without. In 2005, I attended a wilderness first responder recertification. In 2005, I attended a wilderness first responder recertification, and my good friend Peter Lev insisted I go to the Climbers Ranch for a big American Alpine Club reunion. And my good friend Peter Lev insisted I go to the Climbers Ranch for a big American Alpine Club reunion. While there, we ganged up on then AAC President Jim McCarthy. While there, we ganged up on then AAC President Jim McCarthy and tried to get him interested in reprinting. They didn't publish guidebooks any longer. While he was gracious, he later that year on a trip to see a friend in Colorado Springs, I happened upon a later that year on a trip to see a friend in Colorado Springs, I happened upon a late 70s guidebook to Talkeets called Mountain Rocks and a climbing shop. Like Touch the Sky, it had been published by the American Alpine Club. And like Touch the Sky, it had been published by the American Alpine Club. Although this book had a blue cover rather than the deep orange. But it had been reissued by the Mountaineers Books in Seattle. Exchanging some letters and phone calls with the Mountaineers, I was told the needles were too obscure, and the book too outdated, and I was told their needles were too obscure, and the book too outdated, and I was standing in my room in lead, and I stared dejectedly at the floor for several minutes after the call ended, and I stared dejectedly at the floor for several minutes after the call ended. Were to be preserved in print that I decided that if the conroots were to be preserved in print for future generations. My notes, as I mentioned, to write my own book. Some of them would suffice, but others needed much more detail. And since I'd already climbed some of them would suffice, but others needed much more detail. And since I'd already climbed was becoming a little crowded. The conroots at that point. So I had to return to many of the climbs we'd already done and expand my notes. And from that point I had to return to many of the climbs we'd already done and expand my notes. And from that point I wrote a more detailed guidebook I hadn't done before. I wrote a more detailed guidebook-y sounding description. These, I would get a date of their first descent from Piana's book, however, and called Jan I would get a date of their first descent from Piana's book. We spent several hours on the phone as she attempted to steer me in the correct direction. We spent several hours on the phone as she attempted to steer me in the Calamity Ridge. She and Herb, then in their 80s, on Calamity Ridge, Cheryl and Daryl Stisser and Herb, then in their 80s, accompanied Cheryl and Daryl climb out to us to the base of the rock. And Cheryl led what turned out to be the second ascent to us. With the cons watching intently. And Cheryl led what turned out to be the second ascent. On top, we found a pristine con register. Although on top, we found a pristine con register. Although also around this time, I was gifted a copy of Touch the Sky's predecessor. Also around this time, I was gifted a copy of Touch the Sky's predecessor, A Climber's Guide to the Needles. Much of Camps's information about the con routes was very similar to what was already available to me in Piana's book. A rock near Old People's Dome and the outlet rocks. On Top Hat Lake, for example, a rock near Old People's Dome and the outlet rocks behind Sylvan Lake, for example, Camps recommended that climbers make a, quote, delightful leftward spiral, rightward spiral. Well, Piana wrote to make a, quote, delightful rightward spiral. Very important to my project in terms of cross-referencing. Thus became, as much as I love Piana's book and relied on it cross-referencing. As much as I love Piana's book and relied on it constantly. I began compiling my route descriptions into a first draft on an ancient laptop. I forget what version of Word I used, but it was a very early one and had the little paperclip guy to whom you could ask questions, had the little paperclip guy to whom you could ask questions, and I never did. I followed the organizational strategy laid out first by Camps and then Piana. I followed the organizational strategy laid out first by Camps and then Piana. Into the cathedral spires and the picket fence. Then up the Needles Highway and into the cathedral spires and the picket fence. With the Black Elk Wilderness artistically inclined friends Spud Benning and Katie Anderson graciously took over drawing the map. Spud Benning and Katie Anderson. I was shy at first about telling Herb and Jan what I was up to, since they were so reclusive and almost dismissive of their climbs. Preferring to take pride in their jewel cave exploration instead. In my writing a biography of them. I'd asked Jan a couple of years before whether they'd be interested in my writing a biography of the guidebook. She had politely declined. Finally, I did ask for permission with the promise that I wouldn't pry into their personal lives. Finally, I did ask for permission with the promise that I wouldn't pry into their personal lives. I attempted to make the argument to the cons that yes, Jewel Cave was important. I attempted to make the argument to the cons that yes, Jewel Cave was so imaginative, but so were these rock climbs in the Needles. So far ahead of their time, so imaginative. Impressive, quite like so far ahead of their time. The cons thankfully relented and allowed that a guidebook would be okay. The cons thankfully relented and allowed that a guidebook would be okay. With me, going so far as to copy certain entries from their journals by hand and mailing them to me to copy certain entries from their journals by hand and mailing them to me to the Northern Hills during species. To check it out later. And the envelopes were cheerfully adorned with drawings and Jan's wood stamp. And the envelopes were cheerfully adorned with drawings
a mess of old slides of them climbing. I was able to get those digitized. And they also uncovered a mess of old slides of them climbing. 2007 and 8 learning the rudiments of Photoshop to try to remove dust from these pictures. 2007 and 8 learning the rudiments of Photoshop to try to remove dust from these pictures. But by then I had access to a big laptop finally computer at the house. By then I had access to a big boxy iMac computer at the house Chris so I forged on. I finally finished a draft in very early 2008 and printed it, and Jan read it and made numerous very early 2008 and printed it, and Jan read it and made numerous revisions for several months. When we found a mistake, I didn't just have to fix it in the Word document. When we found a mistake, I didn't just have to fix it in the Word document. My finding a publisher was a happy accident. I was doing all of this with no publisher and no idea how to find one. I was doing all of this with no publisher and no idea how to find one. As working as my good friend Tara Sunshine was working at the camp as the campground attendant. And Fred and Heidi Knapp of Sharp End Publishing came to the Needles looking for John Page. And Fred and Heidi Knapp of Sharp Tara excitedly told them about my project, and they were interested in it. And so Tara excitedly told them about my project, and they were interested in it. I never shopped the manuscript around or anything like that. I was just grateful that the book would see the light of day. I was just grateful that the book would see the light of day. And although it seemed a little weird to have to omit non-con favorites like classic crack and beer and pretzels, and the book, as I always said, is my Valentine to the cons. And the book, as I always said, is my Valentine to the cons. A companion volume, at least, to their book, The Jewel Cave Adventure. And I just want to close by recognizing, I mentioned this earlier, but just want to close by how gratifying it is to see the next generation of climbers enjoying these antique gratifying it is to see the next generation of climbers enjoying these antique in conversation, and even using them as reference points in conversation. And we hear people speaking casually now, and that sort of thing. Teeter-totter tower. And again, my fear was that back fence posts were just going to get lost. And again, my fear was that these climbs were just going to get lost. All, except for a big thank you. Thank you, everybody. Well, that's all I have for you all, except for a big thank you. Thank you, everybody. Here's the Andrea. You're the first. Here's the Andrea. Oh, I suppose we can do that. Oh, I suppose we can do that.
We're short on time here, but I bet there's some great questions out there, so I'll give the mic back to you.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe repeat his question for them. Okay?
Do you want this? We can do that.
Do it.
Okay.
Your question, sir?
When was the last time you got a chance to speak with Jan?
When was the last time you had a chance to speak with Jan? I have to do this for the recording. Go ahead.
1 week ago when she gave me her stuff. Lent me her stuff. Yeah, she's staying with Cheryl and Daryl Stisser in their bedroom after their spare bedroom. After the fire at the concave, they graciously took her in, which is wonderful. I think she's 97 or 98 years old. So yeah, I don't see her as often as I would like, but it's always a joy when I get to see her. And yeah, I got to see her last week. I should have included a picture of her cat. Her cat Vixen, her rescue kitty. So I got to see Jan and Vixen last Saturday. And Jan used to give climbing talks and sing the old songs on her guitar. And her talks, I'm sure, are a little more engaging than mine, but she was very excited that I was going to do this tonight, and she's not here tonight, but she's thinking about us, or she's sleeping. But yeah, I've seen her recently.
Any other questions? Okay, you, sir.
If you were to do a second print, what else would you include?
If you were to do a second print, what else would you include?
Butterfly boulder. There are a few climbs that we didn't find, and my friends and I didn't find, and in that case, I quoted the con's journals directly. Had I known that a fire was going to ruin everything, I would have included more direct quotations like that. I do have a couple of mistakes, too, that I'd like to fix.
yeah, I would love to do a second edition. That's a whole grant project. We can talk about that later. But I'm like looking at you like, what do you know about grants? But yeah, I would love to do a second edition and update and find and climb Butterfly Boulder, which is one of the missing climbs in my book, which has since been found by the Brumbaugh family, rediscovered, I should say. So, yes.
Anybody else? We'll take one more. There you go.
Do you have any other books you are writing or plans for different books?
We have a question. Do you have any books you are writing or plans for books?
Other than a second edition of the Kahn book, well, my grandiose academic plan is to edit an anthology of South Dakota writers, which will take 20 years. And so I'm starting to kind of gather notes for that. But that's kind of a huge goal. I mean, in terms of like Needles climbing books, I mean, I don't know if anyone's seen the Lee Ortenberger Guide to the Tetons, the big comprehensive book. That's what we need, I think, for the Needles. And my work is kind of like a first chapter, but then there's the heyday and John Gill, of course, in the 60s and Camps and Rearick and that crowd and so on through the decades. And there's thousands of climbs there. And I mean, if the minute we wrote it, and it would be others and me. Like I would love to be in an et al. That's another of my academic goals. That's Latin for and others. But someone else, like it could be like Chris Hirsch et al. And I would be in the et al. Like I just kind of want to be in the et al. But yeah, it would be a community effort. And it would take a long time, and it would be out of date, I think, the moment it came out. It'd have to be updated, and I don't know. I'm not super familiar with the world of publishing, but I think, yeah, every few years it probably need a new edition. But anyway, so big books, big plans on the horizon, and I should probably just write some articles. So.
How are your
cats?
How are they?
Cats.
They're lovely. They're doing really well. Thank you for asking.
We got one more. We'll
Okay.
do this.
Lindsay, how about writing a book about you and how it changed your life?
How about writing a book about you, girl?
Yeah, I'll need a pseudonym, and then that would kind of ruin it, wouldn't it?
I think that'd be a really good one for a lot of people.
I'm not ready. I'm not ready. But yeah, it's a good idea. It'd probably be inspirational to some people, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe someday.
All right.
Thank you.
From my perspective, I'd like to thank you for saving this part of South Dakota history.
Oh, well.
It's very important for all of us. You've enriched your sport that you love. You have gotten the history for us all to read that I don't think is just for climbers. And this was a really important part of our history, and you've saved it. Let's thank Dr. Lindsay Stevens. This is a rare treasure right here, so let's give all the support we can. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank Camp for having us here this evening.
Oh, and feel free to come look at the Kahn's equipment.
Come look at the stuff.
What?